I have something very exciting to show you. Check this out. There it is. Okay. For a second, I thought it wasn't going to get hit. We have breakpoints now. Now, this does come with a caveat because of the way that the Nintendo 64 loads things. I can't place a breakpoint in ZENMAG. ENMAG is updating right now, even though you can't see it. Notice how we have breakpoints here and they're not getting hit. So ENMAG is what's called, well, is in an overlay, or it's part of an overlay. And the way overlays are loaded on the Nintendo 64 is they're sort of loaded dynamically, which means we don't always know where in memory this code is going to exist. There are scripts to help us do this, thanks to Dragorn421 and Fig. I haven't gotten around to doing those yet, but I wanted to show y'all that we can at least breakpoint the main chunks of our code here. So while we're switching game states, what's going to happen is our breakpoint is not going to get hit. I assume this screen is also a, there we go. Awesome. So here's our breakpoint. So we can see some stuff now. Take a look at this. So in our game state, we have a graphics context. Don't know what's happening in there. It's probably the memory address for the main function. Now I do need to go through the step of figuring out how to load overlays and debug into those overlays. Still exciting nonetheless. So I'm going to go ahead and resume. And for the rest of this episode, we're not really going to use these breakpoints yet, but still very exciting to see that you can do this. So there's actually another way to debug Ocarina of Time. Let me show you. Launching Ares by the command line, you will get output from whatever game it is that you're running. So that's another way to get about doing this. I'm not going to bother with it right now because we need to start digging into the next screen here, file select. I have a question for you if you're watching this, and even if you are an experienced, let's say, code spelunker, and you're very familiar with this code base in particular, how many states do you think this menu has? Now, what do I mean by state? I mean that we are currently in a state right now. We're in file select and we're in kind of this neutral state. We're not in any one of these menus, but if I press A here, I go into a new menu, which means we're in a different state right now. And if I go back, we go back to that original state. So we have options, erase. Erase does this. This is another state. When I try to pick a file, now I have to confirm it, right? That's another state on top of that. So try to take a guess at how many states exist in this menu. So let's take a look. There are 40 states in this screen here. This is the point where I started digging into this code just on the side. And this is one of the things that made me stop and say, okay, I need to kind of do this, on a recording. Okay, so we have 7 select modes. Okay, so these are all this is an enum that refers to a specific label that's going to be at the top over here. So please select a file is please select a file. So we're currently on the title label of select file, which checks out. We have warning labels, button index, file 1, 2, 3. Yeah, files 1, 2, 3, copy, erase, and options. Oh, I guess only the PAL version has a language select. So what I want to see now is where do these exist? I guessed that a lot of what made up file select, a lot of this screen here, were actors in the world. Question is, okay, we have a file choose, Z file. I found this random file, right? But like, how do I figure out what's going on here? I'm just gonna look at the folder structure first. So source, overlays, game states, overlay for the file choose, copy, erase, name set. And this is file choose. Okay. Quest item textures. Oh, okay. So we're storing these because we need to be able to show it when a person is loading their game. That checks out. Well, there's got to be an update in here, right? Main, it's probably main. This probably gets set here. And this probably init? Yep, file select init. So we've seen this pattern before where when we change game states, we call an init function. That init function generally says, okay, set the main function so that when the core game loop is updating, we saw it earlier, when this is happening, we need to know which main function to call. So when we're in file select, I would wager that file choose, setting this state main is what's allowing this core game loop to call this function every single frame. And we can see when we go into game state init here, actually, so where it's going to happen is we are going to call this overlays initialization function. So that came from load game state. So we're loading in an overlay. We load the overlay. We have its initialization function. So in game state init, we're going to call that init function right here. So this init is calling the init that exists here. Not exactly in this one, but here. So that's going to call this. This sets main to say, hey, every single time the core game loop is saying update, call this file select main. So this is this screen's update function. What does it do? We get input. Oh yes, okay, this is actually our first instance of seeing how the game checks for the controller state. So controller state is a really interesting thing. So let's take a look at like stick adjacent. I don't know what this would be short for. Post in the comments if you know. But we're checking if it's less than -30, but what the heck is -30? So I don't know about the N64 controller, but I know this about the Xbox 360 controller, is that the state of this stick right here is stored as an angle of rotation, where 0 would be direct centered, left would, I believe, be negative on the x-axis, right would be positive on the x-axis, up, well, it depends on what kind of game engine you're working this. Up could be positive on the y-axis or negative. I believe in XNA or mono game, subtracting to the y coordinate will actually take you up. So here we are checking for input. We are getting input here. We're taking it out of the state. We are then checking the input's x position and the input's y position. Storing it for a second, checking, are we less than, let's just say -30 degrees. Then we're checking if our stick X direction is already -1. Do something about an input timer. But what does this ultimately do? This ultimately sets stick X direction. That's interesting. So yeah, once we know that like, hey, we are moving the stick left in the X direction. Let's ignore this for a second. We set the stick X direction to -1, meaning, okay, we know the stick is going left. And set this timer here specifically for the X direction to say, okay, let's make sure that they can't do it immediately again. How does this timer play here? So yeah, if the player is holding left, meaning we've already seen that it's -1, we set -1, we go again, we hit the top of the loop and we check this again. If it's still -1, then we're going to subtract from the input timer. If that timer didn't exist, then you would just fly across the screen. In fact, now that we can make adjustments to this game, let's see how that works. Let's remove this timer. So I made the change, let me build it. In the meantime, while that's building, the pulsate cursor, this is probably going to mess with some transparency. Updates the alpha of the cursor to make it pulsate. Yep. On the debug ROM, this function also handles switching languages with controller 3. I did see this here. It's taking controller 3's input. If you look at this and you're a little confused because it says 2, numbers are 0-based generally in programming. So 2 is really 0, 1, 2, which is the third thing. So we get player 3's controller and then do some fancy stuff with it. Get the alpha step and we get the direction. Yeah, this is cool. This is cool. It's fairly straightforward, right? I mean, you have a step. That's how much you want to modify your transparency by. You get this highlight color. If we can take this 3 to be alpha, and that's the 4th number there, then I'm gonna guess RGBA, and we move it by a certain amount. That's really cool. Okay, so the build is done. If I did this correctly, then if I hold down, I should just fly down the menu. Yes, look at that. Okay, Cool. We've made a change. This is one of the first changes I've ever made in this game. If you don't have that timer when you're checking for input, then this is what's going to happen. So you need to have some sort of timer because this game is running at who commented this? Let me find it. Yarhar0, who said, in regards to a certain timestamp, if we're only talking about the NTS versions of Ocarina of Time, it is capped at 20 frames per second during cutscenes and gameplay, with the frame rate cap increasing to 30 frames per second when in the pause menu. Interestingly enough, file select is actually capped at 60 frames per second, which I believe is the only spot in the game where the cap is raised this high. And MZX Rules points out that the logo also runs at 60 frames per second. So yeah, this is going to happen 60 frames per second unless we put a delay on it. Really, really neat little detail. And these states up here, let's go back to file select H. These states, let's look at how config mode is actually used in here. So fade in start. So this is what I want to look at. I want to look this up because this happens a lot, right? Yeah. So our mode is fade in start. And we are in menu mode config. Fade in end. Oh, when the X position has reached a certain... Let's see. So when we start the fade in, we reduce the alpha of the black screen fill to create a fade in effect. So there's just a black image there that we reduce the alpha on to let it fade in. Additionally, slide the window from the right to the center of the screen. So we constantly subtract 20 from that window's X position until we hit a certain amount, and then we set it to that amount, and then we say we're done fading in. That's fun. So what do we do next? Finish fade in. So for finish fading in the remaining menu elements, fade in the control text at the bottom of the screen. Update function for that. So we are fading in the controls for the alpha value, fading in other things, and then once it's done fading, we now know that we're in the main menu. Now what is this? If we press start or A, then we check if our button index is on file 3. Is there another check for file 2? I'm looking at this if statement. So I'm following this line right here. So this if statement, like each of these if statements has a certain scope to it, meaning it covers a certain amount of code. So I'm following this one because I want to see what other if statements are here. There are multiple ways to do this. You could follow the line all the way down until you hit a curly brace. Or, because VS Code is very, very nice, you could just click on the curly brace over here, scroll until you see a highlighted curly brace. But sometimes that can be hard to see. So the else here, we just go to an else. Okay, this is update main menu. Oh, hey, a comment. Update the cursor, wait for the player to select a button to change menus accordingly. If an empty file is selected, enter the name entry config mode, because we're creating a file. If an occupied file is selected, enter the select menu mode. Ah, so we have like multiple states here. We are either selecting something. Let's see. Yeah, we're either selecting something or we are in config mode. So we're checking if the button index, which I assume is the highlighted button, is less than or equal to the main file number 3. So let me show you. So that's this one here. If we're less than or equal this index, we're checking, are we pressing the button on any of these files here? If we are, what's going to happen? Our config mode, well, first let's check, is the slot occupied? If it's not occupied, then we have to enter name entry. So our config mode is rotate to name entry. So let's see what that looks like. So we have no slot occupied. We rotate to name entry. So, but we don't just go immediately to name entry. Let me go back. So you can see that there's a rotation here that happens. And I think something that surprised me when I looked at all the states happening here is that this transition in of itself is a state. So let's go to rotate to name entry. So we have rotate to name entry and then name entry. And do we have like a rotate to anything else? No? Okay, well what happens if I go copy? Ah, that's like a slide. Setup copy source. This is probably that. Yeah, okay, I see. So right now, we're in the main menu. If I hit copy, then we go to setup copy source, where setup, I bet, is the transition, and then select copy source is now where we're at. So the thing that surprised me was that there's a state for every transition, which I didn't really expect. Because you could do it multiple ways, right? You can have the final states. You could have only this and only this. And you can have a sort of like, what's my current state and then what's my target state? And then once you have a target state, you can set some like, oh, now I'm transitioning. Let's look at the current and the target and then decide what to do there. This is a much more explicit way of doing it. It's not like it's good or bad or anything. It's just interesting to see how it's done here. So now we're in select copy source. If I pick something that didn't exist, is that a new state? No, we just play a sound. If I select something that does exist, we're probably going to a new state now, which had a transition of itself. And now we get to see we're in a new state. So what state would this be? This would probably be select copy destination. And take a look at how there's a setup copy destination 1 and 2. What does that mean? So we have setup copy source, which gets us to this menu. Now we are in select copy source. So setup copy destination 1, I'm not sure what that means. It's probably if you picked file number 1, which moves file 1 up and then shows us a menu relative to file 1, right? So I'm assuming 2, if it were, let's copy a file to 2. Okay, so let's go to copy again. Now this, I assume, would be setup copy dest 2. Oh, I see it, because it grabs an entry and then takes it up. So if I go back, actually, let's copy over to 3. And let's do, there is no empty file. Let's delete number 1. Okay, so let's go to file copy 3. And I'm assuming it's going to get grabbed and then go up. Yeah. So my assumption here is that we have setup copy destination 1 and 2. And we only have 2, even though we have 3 files, because file 1 is a unique one. It just slides upwards, which is different than if you had selected 2 or 3. So let's go to copy. I'm going to select file 1. It slides up. Let's go back. It slides down. Select file 2. I guess it does slide up too, but the other one slides down. So file 1 slides down, meanwhile file 2 slides up. Yeah, the other ones slide down, it slides up. Okay. So we have 2 of the exact same behaviors and then 1 that's different here, which is why I assume setup copy dest 1 and 2 are 2 different states and not necessarily 3 different states. And then we end up in select copy destination. Now we're looking at, oh, we have our exit. I'm looking over here right now. So now we have our exit to copy source 1, exit to copy source 2, which I assume go backwards in the same way that they went forwards. Copy confirm 1. So if I hit enter, are you sure? And then we have another one there. Oh, file 1 fades away here. Oh, file 3 fades away here as well. I'm not sure what those 2 states would be for. Copy confirm is next, line or number 12 there, where we either say yes or no. Then we have return to copy. And we have a bunch of animations here. What are the other animations? I'm only kind of seeing the same one, but it sounds like they have 5 there. How many erase animations? There are 3. Let's erase this. Drops into oblivion. They seem to kind of do the same thing. Yeah, these animations don't look any different, but... Okay, I'm gonna cut the video there. I'm gonna keep this one much shorter than my previous ones. Once again, I am looking for a video editor to help me out with some of this stuff because it just takes too much time. So yeah, reach out if you can find me on the Zelda Discord, the decomp server, and yeah, hit me up. Let's talk. I want to do more of these, but I don't want to edit so many of them. That is it for now. Thanks for sticking around, and yeah, hopefully by the next time I figured out how to get overlays working with breakpoints, because that will be another interesting way to sort of dig through this and see, okay, what state are we in when we hit B over here, instead of me just sort of looking and guessing all the time. All right, catch y'all in the next one. See ya.